Last week on Mother's Day, the Gospel from John said, I leave you peace, my peace I give you, not as the world gives. Very similar to the peace that we get from our mothers. Very much like the peace we get from Jesus, because our mothers have an unconditional acceptance attribute of love. Part of that love. Unconditional acceptance for all of their children. Okay? And there's nothing more peaceful than being accepted, you know. And so that's what we get from Jesus. We get that unconditional acceptance. I think it's very similar to a mother's giving and a mother's love. We also heard, not as the world gives. You know, it's more like Jesus' relationship, and it's different from the rest of the world. It's not peace of mind, it's peace of heart. We also heard in the Acts of the Apostles last week what would be equivalent to the first council when they met and there was an uproar. And they were very disturbed, and it said right in there, I know I've disturbed your peace. The peace of mind was disturbed, as the world gives. And then he went on to say, but don't worry, Barnabas and Paul are going to be with you, and Barnabas and Paul are followers of Jesus Christ. There's a different kind of peace. And so it's not peace of mind that we think of, that we relate to in so many areas of our life. It's peace of heart. Jesus never promised happiness. It's peace. You know, happiness comes and goes depending on circumstances. Sometimes it's a little bit overrated, but God loves to be happy, but he never promised that. That's peace. And it only comes with a deep, honest, sincere, sorrowful contrition with the sacrament of reconciliation. I remember one time when I started receiving the sacrament of reconciliation somewhat regularly, but not as regularly as I do now, because it's changed my life now to receive it just on a monthly basis. It's very Eucharistic to me. It's the closest thing to being, for me, in the presence of Jesus. But as I started to, I'd say more about 15 years ago when I started to receive the sacrament somewhat frequently. I was downtown and I went into a big church. It wasn't St. Peter's or the cathedral. I can't remember what it was now. But they were going. It was around a holiday, so I'm going to sneak in there and go to confession and get my confession in. I picked out an older man that I figured would be half asleep. He really wouldn't care because he wouldn't know me and I don't know him. And he's the only priest that ever just yelled at me, challenged me, about my contrition and my sincerity, and just let me realize how important it was, and just really read me the right act. Basically, called me a liar. But I mean, he just didn't accept what I was saying to him, and it wasn't anything all that different than I might have done and got away with before, but he was the only priest that has ever challenged my sincerity. In the book of Exodus, Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord, and rising early the next day, he erected at the foot of the mountain an altar and 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. Then, having sent certain young men of the Israelites to offer holocaust and sacrifice of young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord, Moses took half of the blood and put it in large bowls, and the other half he splashed on the altar. Taking the book of the covenant, he read it out loud to the people, who answered, all that the Lord has said we will heed and do. And then he took the blood and sprinkled it on the people. This is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words and rituals. Again, looking back at the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, which Jesus fulfilled and made new, there was no person there in Jesus. And this ritual with the animals did not bring lasting faithfulness. It just didn't. Now, Jesus taught the same thing, but he taught it in a different way, and he was there. You know, he was the sacrifice, and he was there when he taught very similar teachings as the Old Covenant. Of course, he did teach a lot of very countercultural ways of life in regards to service and forgiveness, but still, much of what he taught was very, very similar. But he was there. He was there as the example. He was there as the truth, as the unending example, and a light that would never burn out. So he was the sacrifice. And that's why in the 6th chapter of John, he was able to tell people that unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you'll have no life in you, and those who do eat my body and drink my blood will have everlasting life. Because he was there. He could teach that. So this sacrament too, the Eucharist, along with the sacrament of reconciliation, as mentioned earlier, kind of like the nourishing and strengthening times, that ordinary time of our life, forming us for when we do understand and recognize where we're being called and sent in our lives, in our vocation. I believe, personally, that the only way we can really have a unified relationship with Jesus is to have a complete attitude of thanksgiving, understanding, that we didn't really deserve anything, which is what mercy is all about. Not deserving it, but getting it. Instead of getting a 10-year sentence, the judge says you get 1 year. It's mercy. And we didn't deserve, we didn't do, he just chose us to give us life, and then, our redemption, of course, wasn't anything that we earned. So, unless we really, I believe, have that total attitude of thanksgiving, we really can't enter into that truly and honestly, that union, that complete union, which leads us to servanthood, through the passion, death, and resurrection. I think that's what brings us to our fullness, which is all we're really called to be, is just the best human being that we can be. And without that total union, I really don't believe that we can have that fullness that's necessary, which we hear. I didn't want to pull out any because there was many. In the first letter to the Corinthians, all the necessities that we're called to in action. We're all called to action. And without that understanding, I don't believe of mercy and understanding and being thankful for it, the attitude of gratitude, we really can't enter into that action, that authentically, that life of servanthood. The Eucharist, in many ways, I know it does for me, helps me to obtain a real peaceful confidence. We can obtain that, and I have, and I'm sure many of you have, in a lot of different ways. Contemplation, and scripture, and just lots of variety of spiritual aids and prayer methods, all the sacraments, of course. We can obtain that spirit that can overpower us. And sometimes, and I'm sure many of you could share, I know I could, a few times where that spirit was very, very powerful and present. And it was different than anything that ever happened to you. Maybe it was somebody praying over you, maybe at a healing mass.